So we seem to have a toilet that has some issues with continuously running. In doing some internet searches, I found a video on how to try and correct this from continuously running by removing the cap off the top. First you turn the water off at the water supply at the valve and turning the cap because it's just out of adjustment. I tried that, but it's still continuing to leak. So that would lead me to suspect that the fill valve is now broken or defective. So we'll just take a few minutes and actually just pop a new fill valve in. So the first thing you want to do is you want to turn off your main water supply to the toilet at the wall. So as the old saying goes, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. So we're turning the valve clockwise and you can hear that stop the water from running. Okay, now that we've got the water shut off, we just need a few basic tools in order to complete this repair. And I just have those sitting over on the edge of the tub. The first thing we have is a new fill valve for the toilet. Where I live, Fluid Master is readily available at retail stores or at plumbing wholesalers. The price on these is roughly around $20, give or take a little bit, so $20 to $25 for the fill valve, and everything you need is in that box. And then if your nut on the bottom of the old one is a little tight, you can use a wrench to loosen it, but when we come to do the install, it's always just hand tight. I have a pair of cutters to cut the tube for the bowl fill line, which we'll show in a minute. And then I have a little pail and a few rags in the pail, because invariably when you do this, you usually spill a little bit of water, so just to catch what may drip as you're doing the job. So now that we have the water turned off, we'll give the toilet a flush to drain out the majority of the tank. So now that we've turned the water off to the toilet and we've given it a flush to empty out the tank, there's still a wee little bit of water left in the tank, probably an inch or two in the bottom. That's unavoidable to have a little bit left over. That's why we have the pail, so that when we go to remove the old valve, it'll want to drain out, and we'll try and catch as much of that in the pail as we can. So once we have the water turned off, then we need to disconnect our water supply line to the old fill valve at the bottom of the tank. So as I'm doing a job like this, I usually like to have a handy little light with me. The one I have today is a little Milwaukee rechargeable LED light, a couple of light settings, because usually the toilet's tucked in the corner in the bathroom and it's a little bit dark under there. So I usually just like to have a little bit extra to see what I'm doing and make life a little easier. Okay, so now that we have the water supply turned off and we flushed the toilet, we'll just unscrew our water supply line. I've placed a rag on the floor because there'll be a little bit of water drain out of the supply line itself. Let's make sure our valve is totally snug. And after you give the toilet the flush, you should be able to tell if that shutoff valve is holding. If not, it'll still have a little bit of water running by and you'll hear the sound of it, but our shutoff valve holds, which is good. So you pull the new fill valve out of the box, and this is the new fill valve assembly itself. The threaded portion drops through the hole in the bottom of the tank, and it's basically a compression fit with the nut. And so we want to have this ready to go before we start pulling the old one out. I'll leave those guys there. So this is the nut you use on the bottom of the tank. You have your washer that comes with it. The middle O-ring part is just from manufacturing. You don't actually need that on the valve, so it just has the 4 little tabs that hold it in. You can just easily push them out by hand, or you can use a pair of scissors or a knife blade. You just want to be careful you don't cut your ring, your main O-ring, because that's what seals it. So you take your fill valve, you slide your O-ring up on the threaded shaft on the bottom of it, and you want to get that flush with the bottom of the valve, because that'll be what sits in the tank. And then when you put the new valve in, the nut on the bottom will hold it, so your tank is in between and it's just a friction fit. So you want to make sure you get your rubber O-ring nice and tight to the base of it, so that'll provide a good seal. So now we've got that ready to go, we'll just leave them off to the side. And now we're ready to start taking out the old valve. Okay, so now that we've got our new valve ready to go, what we're gonna need to do is loosen off our nut that's on the old fill valve. So I have a larger size crescent wrench here, and we're just gonna use that to loosen the old nut off, and that's about all we'll need this for. Or if you come from the other side of the pond, it is referred to as an adjustable spanner. Turn this off. So this can be a little bit of an awkward spot depending upon the setup of the bathroom and the positioning of the toilet. So this is where you may feel like you have to be a little bit of an acrobat. So once you get your wrench set up for the proper size of nut, you just want to use it to gently loosen it off. Once you have it started, then you can just do the rest by hand. So at this point, you want to place your pail under the tank where the old fill valve is. As you're loosening the nut off, you want to keep pressure on the valve in the toilet, because as soon as you undo that nut and take the pressure off, the remaining little bit of water in the tank is going to want to leak out. So now we'll remove the old valve. So you can see as I take it out, all the extra water drains out. So here's the extra water that was left in the tank. You can see we've got almost half a pail full, so it's still a fair little bit. My rag that I put down is a little bit wet, because even though you're trying to do two things at once and hold the pail in a good spot, you'll still get a little bit dripping down, but that's why you put your rags down, to minimize the amount that you're losing. So after you've got the old valve out, I just set them in the corner of the tank for now, but we're done with that. When you pull the old valve out, you want to be careful when you're handling it. The old rubber gasket on the bottom, over time sitting in water, they start to deteriorate a bit, and if you touch them, your finger gets really nice and black. So you want to be careful not to touch that like I just did. So once we get that out of the way and we make sure we're not making little black marks everywhere, we take our new fill valve that we started the prep on with the rubber gasket on the bottom and our nut for the underside of the tank. So you want to place your new valve in the hole securely. Things you want to watch for is your little fill tube that goes to your bowl fill tube. You want to make sure it's pointed in the general direction of the bowl fill tube, and you don't want it pointing the opposite direction, and you'll see why in a minute. The other thing you also want to watch is just for the float arm, and the adjust height on the float on the new fill valve isn't going to interfere with your toilet handle flush arm or the chain that goes to your flapper valve. So since they're a little bit on the close side, I'm just going to rotate it a little bit so you can see that I have that spacing there, and your port is still pointed in the general direction. You don't want the port on the opposite side. So once you have that kind of lined up, then the next thing we need to do is put the nut on the bottom to secure the new fill valve in the tank. So once you've got your valve in the new valve in the tank and it's roughly positioned where you want it to be, the next thing we need to do is to put the locking nut on the bottom. So I'm going to change hands here. So you reach down underneath, and again, this is where you might have to be a bit of a contortionist. So you start your nut. So as you're tightening your locking nut on the bottom, you just keep a little bit of pressure on the top of the valve to keep your correct alignment in place, and you just tighten by hand. Once that's on, you tighten your water supply nut, again keeping a bit of pressure on the top of the valve. Once your locking nut and your water supply line are hand tight on the bottom, you can let go and everything should stay where it needs to be. So the next thing we need to do is we have our fill line that goes from the port on the side of the valve to the bowl fill tube. So one end of the hose goes on there. So you want to just support the back of the valve as you just gently push that on. It'll take a little bit of effort, so that's why you want to hold your valve that you're not twisting it or accidentally snapping it. So you can see that you've got a fair bit of tube left. I'm going to take the old clip off. They send a new clip, and what this does is this directs the water down the bowl fill tube. So it's kind of like an alligator mouth. You just need to open her up a little bit and just slide it down your tube. And you can see they've given us some extra tube, so that's where we can trim it shorter because we don't want it too high, then it interferes with the lid on the toilet. So since I have them handy in my tool bag, I have a pair of rigid tubing cutters here, good for rubber and plastic tubing. In this case, I'm going to use it just to trim our little tube to our bowl fill valve a little bit shorter. So you want to have a nice arcing angle on it so you don't end up putting a kink in the line so it gets good flow, but you don't want it too high that it's going to be sticking above the lid height. So I just kind of use my thumb as a guide. You can see where it's going to rest on the clip just to get me an approximation of the length that I'll need. You want to have a nice sweeping curve. You don't want to have it too tight that you pinch it or kink it so it restricts the water flow. So I just kind of get a good idea where it's going to be. Use my thumb there as a guide, and then I just take my tubing cutters, give it a little snip. If you don't have tubing cutters, you can just use a pair of scissors, and then you just do the same thing on this end. You just support the clip, give the tubing a push, and then you just slide it into place. Now that we've got the new fill valve into place, it's securely fastened. I'll just quickly double check. My nut's tight, my water line is tight. We have the bowl fill tube in place. Now we will turn the water back on to the toilet so it's lefty-loosey or counterclockwise. So I slowly open it at first, and then we can just gradually open it all the way. Turn it all the way till it stops. So now as the bowl's filling, you can see that the bowl supply line is squirting down the tube, which is where it's meant to go to help fill the bowl after a flush. The water level's coming up. Now we're just going to watch and see the height of the water as the tank fills. So now that we've turned the water on and let the tank fill for the first time, we can see we're quite a little bit below where our water line should be for a proper flush. So what I like to do before I adjust the height of the valve itself, I turn the water off again. So we've already seen how to do that. So that's the noise you're hearing as I'm just closing the valve. And I like to do that for a couple of reasons, because we need to undo the little white locking ring on the bottom. And while you're doing that, if you have water to it, if you accidentally let the valve come apart because it's two pieces, you can have a geyser and a runaway on you, which is never a good thing. Okay, so with the water off again, we're just adjusting the height of our fill valve. So with the one hand, you want to hold the top of the valve so it doesn't pop off. And this is a little trickier, but the little locking ring on the bottom, you just pull up on it. You want to support the fill valve, and then you can just gently pull up on it because there's the little ribs, and you can click it one rib per adjustment. And then you got to make sure that you click that locking ring back down, or once you have water pressure, it can shoot the top of the valve off, and you don't want that if your lid's off. So I'm just kind of guessing where it needs to be for now. So I've clicked her up about 3 clicks. Make sure my locking ring is down and locked. Give it a little wiggle. And now I'm going to turn the water back on and we'll see where we end up. So after a little bit of adjustment, the locking ring's in place, and you can see that our water level is right at the water line on the tank. So it looks like we have a successful install. Even though the top of our fill valve is slightly above the tank line, our toilet tank lid is curved on the inside, so it'll rest on the top of the tank, giving us enough clearance that it won't hit. But we can just double check that as we set it down, that it's sitting evenly, it's not hanging up on anything. And one last check before we're done and we're cleaning up our wet rags underneath is just to make sure there's no leaks at the valve or at the locking nut or the water supply to the toilet. Quick little peek underneath. You can feel with your hands. Everything is nice and dry. There's nothing leaking from the valve or any of the other connections we've played with. Sometimes it can be a little bit misleading with the cold water in the supply line, that it may feel like it's damp, but it might just be the temperature. If you're in doubt, just take a dry rag and wipe everything down, check the rag, and then feel again. Everything looks good, so another successful toilet valve switch out.